It gets harder and harder over time to figure out where certain games fit in the great big annals of computerdom, and there are several reasons for that. Sometimes a new game comes out that does everything the old game did, only better. The game was always based on style over substance, or, the initial impression just wore off. There's all those reasons and so many others. Psygnosis and Reflections Shadow of the Beast, the game we're covering today, is interesting because it can fit into every single one of those reasons, and then some. The game was an instant classic when it arrived back in 1989. There was absolutely nothing like it around at the time. Almost every generation has at least one computer game like this, something that looks like it came from the future that consoles simply could not do, no matter what. The technical marvel in so many words. Crisis in 2007, Deus Ex in 2000, Ultima Underworld in 1992, and in 1989 Shadow of the Beast had it. It was the flag bearer for the glorious computer master race, lording it over the great unwashed. Now, most of the games I mentioned there didn't just have dazzling graphics, they had damn good gameplay too. The whole package was strong. Shadow of the Beast is the odd one out because, well, it wasn't. Ask most people what they think of Shadow of the Beast now, and the best response you're likely to get is that it was an absolutely beautiful, groundbreaking product when it came out that was unfortunately rather empty gameplay-wise, and as such it's not really stood the test of time. That's the fairest conclusion you're likely to get, plus it's the conclusion you're also going to get from me. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching, wherever you are, whoever you may be, have a good one, and take care. Except, of course, that's not it at all, is it? Because, damn it, we have to know the reasons why. And I, fool that I am, have taken on the onerous duty of explaining them. And hey, it's not like there's just one Shadow of the Beast game out there either. The game had 2 sequels, both rather different in their own way, and well worth looking at in their own right. But we have to start with the game that, back in 1989, didn't just move the goalposts, it shot them into the frickin' sun. Now, a few months ago I did a tiny little video showing off a roll-in demo for the Spectrum version of Beast, explaining how wide-eyed it made me back when I was about 5. Quaint, isn't it? Children are, of course, easily impressed. Still, it does bring back good memories. However, it's nothing compared to the original. Just let that cross dissolve wide slowly in, and there you have it. Even now, when I know all the tricks behind the game, I'm still quite impressed. Parallax scrolling, the idea of multiple layers of graphics representing the foreground, background and so on, scrolling at different speeds to create a composite image filled with depth, apparently, is now a pretty well-known tool of the trade, and in the years after Beast, certain companies, particularly Psygnosis themselves, used it so damn much that obvious parallax abuse kinda started to become a fad. Although nowadays it does get used to great effect in a lot of 2D games, particularly Braid. And Shadow of the Beast uses it well too. The amount of scrolling going on here may not be all that impressive in 2013, but the truth is that the game's style just flat out works. It manages to be a lot more tasteful than some of the other games that followed it, and the setting still evokes that feeling of mystery, the atmosphere, that intangible thing. It's kind of like running for a classic prog rock album cover, which is actually kind of appropriate, considering that the game's box art and paintings were created by one Roger Dean. You know, the guy who made all those hippy-dippy mystical covers for Yes and the like. While the backgrounds, enemies and all that are certainly very pretty, the most memorable design is reserved for Arbron, our protagonist. The iconic drawing of him, fist jutting out on the title screen, says it all. He's like a cross between a dinosaur and a skeleton, with features that are almost alien-like, particularly that long head. I mean, if it is an H.R. Geiger homage, it's a pretty good one. Talking of which, skipping through the game a little, does this rifle sound familiar to you? Indeed. Shadow of the Beast does have a sort of mash-up quality to it. It's almost as if the developers' favourite designers came together for, a bit of a punch-up. I suppose in the grand scheme of things, it's not all that original, but in gaming it certainly was, as we had seen nothing like it. But there's one thing that ties it all together: the music. Now, I don't often talk about music in these reviews, as really it should speak for itself, I feel. But David Whittaker's soundtrack deserves it, as it's probably one of the 5 or so greatest soundtracks ever. The slow, atmospheric woodwinds have a feeling of dark, gothic new age. This isn't relaxing music, it's foreboding, yet natural, the sort of thing you'd expect out of Dead Can Dance. Every track is appropriate for its setting, whether slow or fast. The rockier music in the castle can outstrip just about anything else around at that time for sheer intensity. David Whittaker's soundtrack is absolutely monumental, and if I had to give you just one reason why you should play this game, it's to hear that soundtrack. I mean, you could just look it up on YouTube, but that would utterly defeat the object. Sit down, play the game, and just listen to it, as the Dark Lord intended, utterly free of complete idiots talking over every last bloody note of it. But now, after all that, we come to the point where I have to balance everything out. Why hasn't the game held up? What's wrong with the gameplay? Well, the fact is there's just so little there. Shadow of the Beast promised a lot more than it delivered. The presentation makes you think that the whole world's going to be open to you. And the truth is that the game hides its linear nature very well, in fact too well. If you stray even slightly off the path you're supposed to go down, you'll die. Even walking white in the beginning is a fatal error. After a long and punishing journey, you'll reach a castle where, well, you'll be killed because you aren't actually supposed to be there yet. If you want to get anywhere, thou must go left to the tree. Of course, the game never gives you any clues at all as to where you're supposed to go. You learn everything from your own screw-ups, all 96,000 of them. It's a frustrating game in just about every regard. Every enemy is a potential threat. They all seem to come out of nowhere and rush you. You usually only have a punch to use against them, and the hit detection is fragile at best. Arborn moves and turns slowly, and if the punch is even slightly mistimed, you'll take a hit, even if you kill the enemy as well. Too many hits and you die. You only get one life, so it's back to the start with you. The game isn't fun at all to actually play. It's the sort where you always have to inch forward, constantly on guard. And even then there are times where that's just not going to work. The maddening enemy placement, combined with Arborn's massive size and awkward movement, makes for a game that feels comically unfair, and having to start from scratch every single time you die isn't appealing. Honestly, cheating is a perfectly acceptable thing to do in a game like this, at least I think. Then you can concentrate on what the game does well, as opposed to its frankly woeful gameplay. Could be worse, of course. You could be playing the American Genesis version, with its completely botched hyperspeed. Shadow of the Beast Yo Gabba Gabba Edition. Smashing. Anyhow, the paint eventually started chipping away on Beast. Other games came out that matched or even surpassed it, and in the years after its release it had nothing outside of its name and how advanced it looked in 1989. This is a game that got truly staggering review scores when it first arrived. Almost all of them were in the 90s, upper 90s. By the time it came out on budget release a couple of years later, those scores had turned into 50s. And over time that feeling's just gotten worse. Shadow of the Beast is pretty much just a historical curio now. At best it reminds you of younger, more innocent days, greener pastures and the like. You know, that's the only reason why I'm still fond of it, really, despite its many faults. I mean, if you don't have those memories, if you don't have that historical context, if you're interested in old games but, you don't remember them, then you will utterly despise this game. Mark my words. But I could never bring myself to hate it at all. The game gave me too much back when I was young, even in monochrome, and it's still something to look at. Honestly, the best way to appreciate this game now, sadly, is to go to the CubeX55 Amiga Longplay channel and just watch the game. And when I think about it, when I think back to that rolling demo that was on the ZX Spectrum so many years ago, Even my fondest childhood memories of the game are based around watching it rather than playing it. I mean, if you remember that time, if you remember Shadow of the Beast, I wonder, do you feel the same? Please leave your comments in the box below, because, I'd love to know. It's kind of sad, really. For now, though, we need to move on to the game's sequels. As you'd expect, Beast moved a hell of a lot of copies in 1989, and demand for a sequel was high. Reflection Boyos, Martin Edmondson and Paul Howarth actually got it out quite quickly, releasing Shadow of the Beast 2 in 1990. Which was good. The sheen hadn't all come off of the original yet, and people were still impressed. And the game's cinematic intro in particular was undoubtedly staggering for 1990. At least I assume it was, because I never played the game's sequels at the time. And that thing I just mentioned about not really being able to appreciate games like this if you don't have the memories of them, I'm afraid that's going to come into play here. Because I played Shadow of the Beast 2 for the first time for this review, and I utterly despised it. To be honest, there's not a whole lot to say. The game commits all of the design sins of the original, only even more so, as well as adding some brand new ones. It's virtually impossible to actually complete without taking your 10 pints worth of invincibility. Hell, it's even hard with invincibility on. There are a lot more puzzles and set pieces this time around, which should be a good thing in theory, a change from the unending punchabout the original offered. But they're puzzles where if you even slightly screw them up just once, the game is unwinnable. Seriously, it makes the Kin's Quest games look like child's play. Because, once again, death means you start from the year dot. Enable 10 pints and screw up a puzzle? You'll have to reset your Amiga. The action is still the same old running around and hitting people, only it's even harder this time. Enemies just swarm you, and most of the time they spawn infinitely, daring you to get trapped in a loop where the only outcome is your demise. And as good as that picture in the game over screen is, it loses its charm pretty damn quick when you have to see it in full every frickin' time you die. The original was already one of the toughest games around, and the sequel is even tougher than that. It magnifies every single last flaw the original had, and gameplay-wise, I have to say, it's frankly atrocious. If the game has any saving grace at all, then as usual, it's in the presentation. However, I don't think this game looks quite as snazzy as the first did. It's nice to see Arbron go from a full beast to somewhere in between, but his design isn't as memorable as a result. He just looks a bit like a caveman. The game's setting is still fine and dandy, although it feels a lot plainer and muted when compared to the vibrance of the original. The game moves away a bit from the overbaked parallax scrolling, which isn't a bad thing as everyone and their mother were ripping that shit off from the original by 1990. Still, I greatly prefer the original's style, simply because there's less games like that one out in the wild. Primal, red-tinted, hellish games like this one are a whole lot more common, and I couldn't say that Beast 2's the best at what it does. The music doesn't quite match up either. I mean no disrespect to the efforts of the composer, Tim White, as anyone would have trouble following what David Whittaker did, but it just can't escape at all from the shadows. Awful punnery aside, I really hate doing nothing except bashing the hell out of this game and saying nothing good about it. For what it's worth, the game did still sell, and review scores were still rather good, at least the ones I can find were, but Shadow of the Beast 2 never got any kind of re-release, and I do wonder if people actually did start to question at this point just how good the series actually was around the time this came out, whether the game would be able to stand up to scrutiny if you stripped off all addressing. Because on the evidence of playing it now, it couldn't. There were other games around at the time that did just about everything so much better. The looks aren't nearly enough to save the day, as playing it is just beyond hope, and it's frustrating, really frustrating, to see how little Reflections learned from the mistakes they made with the first one. Only the most die-hard fans of the series have any praise for Beast 2, and even then it's usually with the caveat that you have to play the game absolutely perfectly in order to actually get anywhere and not have to endlessly start again and again and again, which in the end simply will not do. It's... well, it's very subpar game design indeed. There, I bloody well said it. And so, finally, we move on to the last game in the trilogy. Beast 3 was released in 1992. Psygnosis was still front and centre, as were Reflections. By this time the original had already kind of been kicked upstairs into the history books. The sequel had been reappraised and virtually cast aside completely. So what could we expect from the third game? Pretty Little Scenes simply wouldn't be enough this time. And guess what they delivered? Yep, Pretty Little Scenes. It still looks great and all that, as everyone knew it would. Arbron's much more human now and seems to have taken to an indie-style look, but the surroundings are still thoroughly alien. And of course there's another stunning intro to pore over before the bell rings for the start of the game. Graphics-wise, I'd actually consider it an improvement on Beast 2, just because I prefer this game's brighter style, but still not quite as good as the first. But was that all the game had to show? Actually, it wasn't at all. Not many people talk about Shadow of the Beast 3 these days, presumably because they expect it to be just like the other two. People did feel burnt a little by the second game in particular, and were likely quite unsure about this one, meaning that the third game didn't shift nearly as many copies as the first two. But there's more actual honest-to-God gameplay in Beast 3 than there is in the other two games combined, and what's here is actually really quite good. A strong Amiga platformer that taxes your brain as well as your reflexes. So what's changed? Well, it's a much more rounded Beast. This time you actually have self-contained levels, so you can go wherever you want without getting completely screwed over. You may think you'll have to go left from the off, but the game actually stops you and screams, "No, one way!" like you're playing a blooming racing game or something. Arbron now has a boomerang type weapon which has much better range against goons, and he controls a hell of a lot better than he did in the previous two games. He's certainly a great deal faster. The game's balance between action and puzzling is quite close to 50-50, and the puzzling is a lot more logical. Unfortunately, Reflections still haven't quite grasped the concept of trial and error yet. A fair few of these puzzles can make the level unbeatable if you screw them up, meaning you'll have to kill yourself. The level system at least makes that better, plus you actually do have lives this time around. There's even the odd checkpoint here and there. You know, it's nice to actually feel as though you can see a hell of a lot more of the game this time around. You won't be inching your way forward with every game over like in the previous two games. The much more traditional system actually helps make the game feel a lot less linear than the first two. It isn't, but at least it's not pretending to be. As mentioned previously, the presentation is still as strong as ever, with graphics and music that are out the wazoo. The music in particular is a massive hit, as Tim Wright's soundtrack is almost as good as the originals, and I wouldn't say that lightly either. Shadow of the Beast 3 is a game that I would absolutely recommend, especially to people who don't actually have much experience with the series. Even though it's completely different from the other games in the series, for me it's the only one you can play today and actually appreciate. It only has major issues with length. There were only 4 fairly long levels here, and it doesn't take long to blitz through at all. Once you know your way around, you can take this game down in way less than an hour. Funnily enough, you could also say that about the other two games. If you played them perfectly, they were both about half an hour long. It's only magnified here because Beast 3 is a much better designed game, and is much more forgiving. It takes a much more reasonable amount of time to learn the game. In this day and age, this is less of a problem. You can either play a vintage cracked copy of the game on WinUAE, as I'm doing, or if your Amiga's still alive and kicking, you can treat yourself and spend a few quid buying the discs. However, at the time, the short length was highlighted by magazines as one of the game's biggest flaws, especially considering you had to pay about 30 quid for it, a premium price for Amiga games at the time. If I'm honest, then I'm not sure if the game would have been worth all that much in 1992. However, it is a perfectly decent game to play now, and it actually brings the Beast series to an unexpectedly high conclusion. Reflections had shown so many times that they could make stunningly beautiful games, but here they showed that they could actually make a good game to go with all that beauty. And that served them well right up to the present day. Well, except for Driver 3 of course, but you know, can't win them all, can you? But that was the end for the Beast. And Arborn's story actually does come to a firm conclusion, as he becomes fully human at the end of the third game. It's nice to see a trilogy of games actually have a proper finish, even if it's one that's as light on plot as Shadow of the Beast is. Perhaps that's because it's such a rare occurrence nowadays. So with that in mind, it's neither likely that we'd see the Beast resurrected, nor is it necessarily wanted. Mind you, who wouldn't want to see those backgrounds lovingly rendered in full 3D by a studio that cared? If someone were mad enough to bring back the Beast for another merry-go-round, perhaps they could finally turn it into the immersive, non-linear, life-affirming experience it always claimed to be, but never quite was until, at least maybe, the very end. Whenever someone really tries to aim for the stars and put on the style, letting that dictate the game as opposed to the other way around, the spirit of the Beast, I like to think, looks on and smiles, whether the end result turns out to be bad or good. And let's not forget that it always was, and always will be, a bit of a looker. God blimey, Governor, you don't get too many of those to the hand. And with that said, it's time to end the video. But I did that already, so I'm just going to dump you onto the recommended video screen. See ya!